Secretary McMahon, thanks for taking the time with us. Let's start where else with Harvard. Is the administration trying to make an example of Harvard?
Harvard is clearly one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And some of the things we were trying to do relative to preventing anti-Semitism on campuses, which is something the president campaigned on, we started really with Columbia, not Harvard. Columbia had been very much in the news. The demonstrations that we were seeing and the people that we talked to at Columbia were really expressing views to, and I talked to some personally. I even talked to a student who said that she was afraid on campus. So we actually did start with Columbia. I met with Katrina Armstrong, who was then the acting president. Actually met with her at Columbia and talked about what measures they were putting in place. And pretty much not simultaneously, but shortly thereafter, had the conversation with Alan Garber from Harvard. So I wouldn't say that, Harvard is certainly, the example to be setting, across the country, but I think elite universities that have not followed policies to prevent anti-Semitism on campus, and then look at the other issues that we wanted to address at the same time. So what we are seeing, by virtue of the action that we were taking, are a lot of other universities who are looking at their policies and making sure that they have preventive measures in place so that there isn't this kind of harassment, so that students can come and get an education and not feel threatened and be afraid to be there.
Your issues with Harvard and Columbia go beyond anti-Semitism, right? Can you speak to some of those issues?
Well, sure. And as we started sitting down and talking with the presidents of these universities and looking at the overall plans that we had in place, we wanted to make sure, in terms of safety on campuses and what were going on, okay, let's look a little bit broader. Let's take a look at what their hiring practices are for a lot of the professors that they're bringing in, especially from outside of the country. Let's look at the students that are coming on board, and are they properly vetting those students to make sure that there aren't activists or those who even might have had terrorist backgrounds. Are we doing that well enough? We also looked at the Section 117 requirements of universities to report how much money they're getting and where that money is coming from, and that was not in place either. So that we've talked about a lot of those things.
But what legal authority do you have to stop activists from campus? Because some might hear activist and also hear free speech.
Well, I used activists as an example, but as we're looking at doing a lot of vetting, the very day last week that I was having my testimony, before the Senate Education and Workforce Committee, that morning they discovered the research scientist at the University of Michigan who came over with those fungus spores to actually introduce potentially into our agricultural products. So part of what we were saying with the vetting is looking at these students and people who are coming in to make sure we're trying as best as possible to check their backgrounds, and are we doing a thorough enough job before those people do come on our campuses.
So there was a letter sent to Harvard by the Department of Education, I think it was May 5th, where it used some pretty combative language. It criticized Harvard for hiring Bill de Blasio, the former New York City mayor. Who wrote that letter?
Well, there was a combination of people who wrote that letter, as normally it happens with a dear colleague letter or a letter directly like that. It is clear through the White House, it is clear through other agencies, and so we try to have a unified effort with that.
I guess the reason I asked is it kind of sounded like President Trump. He wrote, the letter included grants in all caps. Was he involved in writing that letter? Well,
I can tell you that I think you would have even heard, I had heard the president use the language about hiring Bill de Blasio, because as city management courses, and he said, I don't think there's a worse example. So that made it into the letter.
So was the president involved in drafting the letter?
President always, not always. The president does read some of the correspondence like that, or maybe bits and pieces of it, and offer his suggestions.
I guess why was, whether you like Bill de Blasio or not, why was he mentioned in the letter? Does Harvard not have a right to hire a mayor that you all don't like?
I think Harvard, yes, Harvard does have a right to do that, but I think it was pointing out a little bit, where is your judgment? Where is your judgment in who you're hiring, who you're bringing on campus? What is your value system, relative to that? And it was it's a bit of a tweak for sure.
Madam Secretary, you brought up Columbia earlier. they've taken a number of steps to meet some of the demands of the administration. Why are they still being targeted? And is it fair to say that their accreditation is at risk?
Well, we are sitting down with Columbia. I think we've had really good conversations back and forth. And now I've had two phone conversations with the current president, and she came here and we met and had really good conversation with her. And they really do want to make sure that they have the right policies in place. And I think we've made really good strides. The letter to the creditor was simply to say, okay, we are pointing out all of the things that universities must be aware of, and if they are in violation of federal law, then that needs to be on our part. If the accreditor is not aware, we need to make sure the accreditor is aware so that they're following and doing their job as well.
So what specifically do you want to see Columbia do to meet some of these issues?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction. They are taking those steps, and we want to have a whole approach with them, and I think we're pretty close to that.
Just on the research and development front, universities, elite universities like the ones you've described, have often been at the forefront of providing the research that drives the American economy. Do you worry that the research capacity of these universities will be compromised and then it will have an impact on our economy?
I do think there's so much good research that is done at universities. I mean, and NIH made their determination of what funding that they were going to withhold from Harvard. That wasn't us, but we do want to see the research continue. I do think Harvard, though didn't say it directly to me, I did hear that they might use some of their endowment so that there wasn't any gap in this timing with the research. I think the research is important. And I hope it will be able to continue. I met earlier, just a few minutes ago, with the president of MIT, and she was stressing with me, the value of the research that they were doing, and so I think that's important, for all of us.
Tell me more about this meeting with MIT, and just do you think for the schools that are on the list that are not Harvard and Columbia, does Harvard and Columbia essentially set the template potentially for these other schools like MIT? Like the 58 others on the list? Well,
I think the template really comes from what the president really wanted to see when he looked at, and first of all, it really was triggered by anti-Semitism and the steps that these universities were not taking to combat that, and making children or students be safe on campuses, and making parents understand when they send their students and children to school that they can be in a safe environment. So what we looked at was, are there policies in place, and are the universities enforcing those policies? So I think that is what drives, the template for all universities. They're common sense things. There are things like, yes, have peaceful protests, but there is a time and a place appropriate to do that. There are consequences for operating outside of time and place appropriateness, and those actions then have a chilling effect or eliminate that inappropriate behavior.
And we've been told that there are schools like Northwestern in Chicago that have had their funding, some of their funding frozen, and they've simply learned about it through the media. Is there more that schools like Northwestern need to do in order to have their funding restored?
I also met with the president of Northwestern. He came here, and it was a very good meeting. And we are now talking more to the other universities. It's our goal to get these policies in place, and to make sure that there isn't any more funding, however, freezing. But I mean, the president was really very clear. When universities weren't putting teeth into their own policy and enforcing it, we took measures to bring it to their attention, and I believe what we're seeing now is that effectiveness. So that's hopefully the goal.
Do you see any potential compromise with Harvard, or will this ultimately just be settled by the courts?
Well, I certainly hope there's a compromise, with Harvard. I continually say Harvard.
But what could the compromise look like? Because you all have set out demands that they've said no to, and so what are the outlines of a potential compromise?
Well, isn't that the way a compromise always works?
Right. So
each side sets out its demands, so
right.
We'll keep you informed as they get closer.
Any hints about where you might move or where Harvard might move to try to meet in the middle?
We've actually started. I think the original demands about anti-Semitism, they've already replaced the head of their Middle East studies. And so they're doing some things, and you know, we'll get to the right answer if there's a compromise to be made. Part of their lawsuit was really starting that this was infringement on First Amendment rights. We're very clear this is not a First Amendment right. I firmly believe that on campuses there should be the right to peaceful protest and open debate and discussion of ideas. I think that's what university is about, but not when it becomes violent. And that is a Title VI violation, and that's against the law.
Have you met with the Harvard president yet?
I've not met with him, but I've talked to him on the phone.
When? Recently?
Early on, at the
Okay,
beginning
but
of
not
things.
recently.
Not recently,
Okay.
no.
We've talked to folks on the Hill about the idea of closing the education department. We can't find anyone who thinks that Congress is going along with it. So you recognize, right, that it's very unlikely that Congress is going to agree to close the education department, right?
Well, I recognize that clearly it takes a congressional act to close the Department of Education. But let's be mindful of this. I think one of the things that I have talked to Congress about, and it was during my confirmation hearing, I said, the president's goal is obviously not to get rid of education and all of the programs that education has, but they can function through different agencies. You know, IDEA and Title I-A were in place long before there was a Department of Education, and they could clearly continue. Competitive grants, many of those that have to do with workforce development could certainly be handled by labor. So let's take a look at really what does the Department of Education do? We don't educate anybody. We don't set curriculum. We don't hire teachers. We don't buy books. We don't do any of that. And I believe that there is certainly some room to consider where these programs could reside and how they could continue. And my commitment to Congress was working with them to show them where they could reside and how they could be effective. And that's what I would like to do to earn their vote, to understand how we could have savings and eliminate a lot of the bureaucracy of the Department of Education and better serve students and better serve families.
How are you implementing the president's executive order about closing the department without Congress right now?
Well, at this particular point, we're enjoined because the court has said you cannot proceed with that. So we're still in the planning stage.
Okay.
You know, we're not actively taking any effort, but, you know, as I've had conversations. I mean, in the president's executive order, one of the things that he asked us to do relative to workforce development, et cetera, was to talk to commerce, talk to labor. I think that makes incredible sense. I did that when I was at SBA. I mean,
But that would still need Congress, right?
Well,
to move the things to different cabinets, right?
well, to actually move, yes, but to talk about how to go about doing it, what we would need to do, and how more effective it could be, I think is prudent planning.
How many civil rights complaints are currently pending before the Education Department? Do you know?
Wow. I did know that answer. I'd like to get back to you with the exact number.
I think the number I've heard is 25,000. Does that sound about right?
You know what? I'd like to confirm it with you.
How are you going to make progress on this massive backlog of 25,000 with a dramatically reduced staff?
Well, we are doing it. We would have called it restructuring in the private workforce, and it's painful to do. And you look at what functions are doing what. How could you combine them? Are there different approaches to how you could be effective in what you were doing? So part of what happened in the restructuring with, with OCR was to group a lot of the lawyers in terms of expertise instead of just everybody taking on a workload of general parameters. We found that to be incredibly, efficient. But some of those outstanding cases were very easy. You could do a half a dozen of them in a day because they were complaints about, they were little things, and you could really take care of them. So it doesn't say they don't have their work cut out for them. They do, but it's a group that is working very hard. And we also have civil rights that's happening at DOJ, and other departments as well.
You know, you've said you want to return education back to the states, that the states are in the best position to oversee these programs. Why then do you target states like Maine over policies that you don't agree with? Isn't there an inherent contradiction here?
Well, in Maine, it's a Title IX issue. I mean, they were just clearly, in violation of Title IX and said they weren't going to change. So, I mean, you have to respect the law.
We've been told that California is also of interest to the administration. Has there been any discussions about pulling, federal funds from California as it pertains to education? I
think we're looking at all states where we see, violations that are there. If it's against the law, then we're going to make sure the law is enforced. But there are a lot of things that we are investigating and looking into at this point. Whether it's K through 12 or whether it's higher education, I think that's our responsibility at this stage.
But that doesn't necessarily mean returning education to the states if you are going to aggressively enforce civil rights law in certain ways that folks disagree with. I mean, Maine and California, they don't necessarily feel that education is being returned to the states. They feel like actually there's more federal control. Why is that wrong?
Well, education being returned to the states, as I think as the president has defined it, he does believe that the best education is that's closest to the child. So who better to determine how to direct funding than those superintendents that are on the ground? How better to understand what the needs are relative to students with special needs? Who better to determine where they want their child to go to school than parents who are looking at the curriculum of those states? So those are the driving forces that the president is really re-emphasizing about returning education to the states. At this point, the federal government really, as you know, because of all the research you're doing, you know more of this than I do, that the federal government provides 8 to 10% of the total education budget to states. But if we were able to get rid of a lot of this bureaucracy that's in between, then more of that money, I think, would be available to go to the states, and I think can be better spent by the states, and hopefully more of that money would get to the child.
But you're using that 8 to 10%, leveraging it to get blue states to change their policies in ways that you prefer, right? That's the goal of targeting Maine, for instance, right?
I don't think Title IX violation is just getting them on board with our thinking.
Sure. There's debates among lawyers about how to interpret Title IX. But let's move on. Unless you
not
have
according to the Supreme Court.
I'm not sure the Supreme Court has fully settled on that.
The district court, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has not fully weighed in on that.
The district court who overturned the way that the Biden administration looked at it, which then put it back to the way it had been defined before, which were men and women.
Let's do a lightning round if you're up for it. Hopefully relatively.
Well, give it a shot. If I don't like it, I'll just shut it down. How's that?
There was some discussion on the internet when you seemed to confuse A1 and AI. I'd love for you to just briefly speak to what happened there.
Oh, that was so funny. I was at and it was embarrassing. Yeah. I was at a robotic competition. And I mean, I'd been touring all day, and we've been talking about AI every place we went. And I'd been speaking about AI, how great it was going to be, being introduced more and more into education systems. And I was in this big room, and across the whole back of the room was AI, but the I looked like a 1, and I just glanced up and said A1, and of course then that just made national news. I actually, you might find this very amusing. I was actually received a little box with 2 bottles of A1 steak sauce.
Kind of them.
But it was just a slip of the tongue. I don't think I've said it since, though it's been brought up to me many times, and my grandchildren said, Gaga, I mean, really?
During the transition team, did you initially want to be Commerce Secretary?
The president had talked to me about, many places where, he thought that I might be able to serve, and I thought commerce was one. When he talked to me about education, one of the things I said to him was, I don't come from the world of education, so is that absolutely the right fit? He said, I don't want someone from the world of education. My goals with the Department of Education, to have leadership, to have executive ability, because I really do want to shut it down, and I want someone with management expertise to do that. However, he did know that I had gotten my degree to teach when I majored in French in college. I had served on the State Board of Education in Connecticut. And I've been on the Board of Trustees for Sacred Heart University for about 16 years, so I didn't come without any education background.
This is a follow-up from a congressional hearing, I believe. Do you think a teacher teaching about the Tulsa race massacre could count as illegal DEI?
That was asked of me before, and I have not delved into that and looked at it since that question, and I would like to get back to you on that.
But how could that be illegal DEI? I mean, that just seems like history.
So
right?
I was asked, let me see if this piggybacks onto that. So then follow-up questions were like, do you think teaching black history or teaching Asian history of all that? I've said, no, clearly that's not DEI. That is history, and we should learn about that, but we should learn about all aspects of it.
But the Tulsa Race Massacre, you're not sure if that it would
You know what?
constitute as illegal DEI?
It is just not something I've looked into to the exact case, and so I'd really like to brief myself on it.
Is DOE still working at the U.S. Department of Education?
Yes, we do have DOE members here, and they are employees of the department. They've been onboarded as a government employee. They abide by all of the rules and restrictions of a government employee.
Do you consider charter schools public or private entities?
I think they are public schools. Every charter school that I have dealt with has been that public-private partnership.
How often do you speak to the president?
Oh, probably, it could vary. I could talk to him 2 or 3 times in 1 week, and then it could be 2 or 3 weeks go by and I don't talk to him at all. It depends on if he needs to talk to me, he calls.
Do you think children who are unauthorized immigrants have a right to a free public education?
Well, isn't that the law now?
It is, yeah. That's a
So when
Filer veto.
so when those students show up at school, they become part of the school system and they are taught.
Got it.
Just one last one on the president. You first met him, I believe, at a Rolling Stones concert in the early '80s. What is your relationship like with him, and do you think he should seek a 3rd term if he so
Well, I'm not
desires?
even going to address that. We know what the laws of the land are. I didn't meet him at a Rolling Stone concert. He was actually a fan of WWE. So he'd been at a couple of events at Madison Square Garden, and he invited my husband and me to go to a Rolling Stones concert. And so we did, and we had a very enjoyable time with him there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.